Good morning, good evening, namaste, hola, bonjour, geremaid, and maraban. This is Namya Joshi, your host for the day. Welcome to episode 61 of the podcast, Each One, Teach 10, An Amazing World of STEM, an inspiring venture where we'll be discussing that STEM is part of every day for every kid. We all will learn together how to build a STEM culture. Well, for today, my guest is Mr. Frank Moody, who currently serves as the Education Liaison in the USA for GameMaker, a 2D game engine, and I've been using the game design to support students and educators in the creation of engaging learning experiences for over 15 years, including working with GameMaker, Unreal, and Unity. He's also been in teaching administration for 25 years. He's always believed that his role is to, work towards more environmental engineering than being a controller of information. It's a great honor to have you here, Mr. Frank. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you so much. So, how's the weather there?
The weather is beautiful here today. We're having nice sunny weather, so we're probably going to reach into the 80 degrees Fahrenheit today, so a little warm.
That's great. Even here in India, it's getting warmer day by day. It rained heavily last night, so it's a little cool today, but I think the temperature is going to rise soon now here.
Excellent.
All right, so before we start, we would love to know more about you and what are the things that are upcoming for you. So can you let us know towards the audience and also me?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for having me today. I actually was semi-retired. I had worked in a private school for off and on 25 years, either building technology or, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm really an unintentional teacher. I never pursued to become an educator. I kind of fell into it. But I have a love of learning, and I love to learn, and I love to learn new things. And I've been on a pursuit of finding my own curiosity. When we're children, we have great curiosity, and then we get to be adults and we just start going through our roles. But I'm on a true quest now for just to be curious about the world and all the things that people are doing and why things happen, and how I can help change things that happen. I had retired to an island and sitting on the beach. But projects that I'd started 15 years ago seemed to be bubbling up, and I had an opportunity to work with GameMaker and work with game design that I believe in education can make a huge difference in children's lives. Like you, I believe that STEM is everywhere. And it makes zero sense to me why in education we tend to go, here's your STEM class, and for the next 30 minutes you'll learn a STEM skill. Oh, but now go learn something else. I think they all have to be brought in together all the time. So that's my real quest now, is to make sure that every kid has every opportunity in every class to learn new things and to use STEM, because that's what we naturally do every day in our lives now, right? There's not a part of our lives that does not have a touch of technology and the benefits that technology can bring to us.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that you love to learn, and finding your curiosity is your true quest. And you also wish to provide children all the skills that they need, and how you can, give your bit to bring the change. And that's really lovely point when you have mentioned STEM is everywhere. And even when we have, the STEM classes, for 30 minutes is just studying STEM and activities about it. But the actual fun is when you actually realize where, in your daily lives, in the small things that you do or even the big things that you do, STEM is everywhere. The thing is when you can, realize and you can understand and identify how you're using a STEM concept in just a simple task.
Absolutely.
Right. So as we are on a podcast right now, And we know that the podcast popularity is on the rise. Almost everyone is having podcasts all over platforms on Anchor, Spotify, all across the world. So, according to you, what exactly is podcast engagement?
At first thought, if I just sit and I go, oh, I put on my marketing hat and my business hat, I go, oh, well, podcast engagement is just how many people engage in my particular podcast or your podcast. But actually, I think that's a much bigger question and actually a loaded question. I think that if I really sit down and I look at it in the present and I focus on it, podcast engagement is about what engagement is the listener doing with the podcast. Podcast technology on its own is really incredible because it allows us to communicate at a level that we really haven't been able to do before. I mean, if we look at what a great quote from Peter Drucker, who is a very influential person in business management. One thing he said was, the most important thing in communication is hearing what's not spoken. And I think that podcast engagement, and it's something I think we're missing all the way around, even in education today, is that the ability to take a podcast and listen not when you're asked to listen, but to listen when you are ready to listen to the podcast allows you to give more focus into what's being said or maybe even what's not being said. So as a communication tool, it's vastly superior to anything we've ever had throughout our lives. I mean, if you think back and you think to the people human beings are built to communicate. And they're built to communicate not just to each other, but I would argue that we've always been wired to communicate across time. So if we look at caves and cave dwellings and someone would go in and mark, well, there were 15 antelope in this area when I was here, and you might not be communicating to anyone at that point, but then someone else uses the cave for comfort and comes in and goes, well, now I only saw 5 antelope here. And then maybe you come back 2 years later to that same place, and now you're communicating. So humans have been trying to communicate across time forever, but now we can take that to scale with podcasting and actually listen on demand, but not on demand because I want it right away. But when I say on demand, we can listen to it when we're ready to really focus, be in the present, and listen to it.
Totally. I totally agree with the point. Podcast engagement, like you mentioned, is what the listener is doing with the podcast. And it allows us to communicate to a totally different level because, like you mentioned, that human beings have been communicating over a long time. But now with the podcast, we can communicate with anyone at any time. And when we listen to podcasts, we become the audience for a virtual storyteller. And rather than just sharing that setting with others, we alone become the audience. And we get really engaged with, how the podcast is. Like if it's an engaging podcast with education, we can totally relate with those things for an educator. If it's a fun podcast where listen to stories, we get engaged with that as well. And like you said, that we don't need to listen when we are asked to listen, but when you're ready to listen. And that exactly is the main thing, that you're not supposed to listen as soon as somebody's uploading a podcast, but when you're ready to listen to it, you're there listening to the podcast that you love to listen.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So as we talked about educator listening to, podcasts that they love to, I would like to ask you that how can educators use podcasts to increase student engagement in learning in this modern digital age?
Well, I think the very first step is obviously exposure. And I say that word as teachers and as educators in the classroom, exposing students to a world where they can have access. I mean, what a beautiful day we live in where I can go out and look for information on any subject anywhere. I'll go back to a story of my own upbringing. I was a very poor student. I if you look at my education record, you would look at it and go, oh my gosh, what a dismal failure with no potential in the world. But the truth is I was a very privileged person because my father was an academic surgeon and he was internationally known. So he had friends all over the world, and they used to throw lavish parties. There'd be 100 and 200 people. And as a child, I got to wander around and go into conversations of these brilliant people who were from all kinds of different cultures. And the truth is that I would have so many questions on the topics they were doing that I spent most of my time pursuing the questions I had from those conversations, and very little time because the things my teachers gave me seemed of little value to me compared to all these bigger conversations I was finding. And I think that podcasts can do that for our students today. And really, even as we're recording this, it's possible that there is a student who's spending more time listening to podcasts of their interest instead of doing their schoolwork in the classroom. I think as educators, we really need to help students be exposed to podcasts. I think they need to do more podcasts. I think that in preparing for a podcast, there's so much learning that goes on. And again, we get back to this siloed classes. Well, you'll learn English in this 40 minutes, you'll learn math in this 40 minutes. But really, the world of learning for me is much more like the hunter-gatherer education, where you get in and you're doing it hands-on and you're learning the information. I just think that podcasts can help students pursue their own passions that they can then bring back and share with their other students.
That's really inspiring that you're talking about the exposure being the main concept of how we can, use podcasts as student engagement. Because here, like you're talking about how we can expose students to a world where there's access to everything. Like because the way we're growing in this world, new things keep on coming every single day, and one of them being podcasts. Because I personally have seen podcasts being a very big thing since the lockdown has came up, because almost everyone has started their own podcast talking about their personal experiences, and that's how children get attracted to the podcast of their interest. And many of them have taken the onus also to start their own podcasts. And like you mentioned again, this helps them to understand their passion and also motivate other students also to start their own podcasts. So in a way, you're just helping people as well while following your own passion.
Yes, absolutely. And again, it's not so many as how many listeners are at the time. Mm-hmm. But podcasts can reach over vast amounts of time. Maybe 3 years from now, somebody will watch this podcast and go, oh, I'm getting a great idea from this. And that ability to be a part of the historic record is so authentic for our students. I think they naturally will engage because it's of their interest.
Absolutely. And about student engagement, I would like to come up to my next question as well, that how can podcasts assist students in evaluating their understanding in the classroom?
Well, I think that it's the perfect tool for that. I mean, again, if we look at my own history, in order to do a record of some sort, and I built audio studios, large recording studios, and spent a lot of money on equipment in order for kids to cut a CD that they could have an authentic piece of their own learning and a learning artifact that they could take away with them. And in today's world, we have this technology that allows us to do it even on a phone. You and I could be doing this podcast. I could be on my phone driving the car going somewhere else. It may not be a very good podcast if I was doing it that way. But it would still be, we can make a part of the record without building elaborate things. So this technology is so accessible. The other thing that makes it such a great tool for students to use in their understanding of their own understanding is the work that goes into making a good product. You have to do your research. You have to come up with questions if you're doing a podcast that you're going to interview in. If you're going to do a podcast that you're the solo podcaster, you have to be prepared to explain and communicate in a direct manner that your audience can connect with. So I think that when students can take their learning and place that into a podcast and it's authentic with their own interests, it gives them, again, even a record to reflect on, because they can go back and look at where they were coming from, maybe even 2 or 3 years from now. I may even look at this and go, whoa, I could have answered this question a lot of other ways. But that reflection is learning.
I totally agree with that. Like you talked about technology being the most accessible tool, and that's how when we use that, we understand like how times have changed. And like the second thing that you mentioned that I really liked is my students will be able to understand like the work that goes into making a good product, because like you mentioned about solo podcasts where students have to prepare before they start. They just can't like start a podcast, okay, hey, I'm here talking about this. They need to be mentally prepared, jot down the points that they have to speak about, and speak in a way that they can attract their audience. And that's again where when they start with the episodes, they're not just sharing their own thoughts, but they're taking and learning as well of how they have to communicate in an effective manner. And like you mentioned about looking back from where you came and then listen to your first episodes. So recently, even I was listening to my first episode that I had with my principal, and I compared like how I started and how I'm doing right now. And I have been seeing like improvements. So I can improve more, but I can see like I have been getting better. So like that's again, it gives you motivation to make more podcasts and also make them more better than you've made before.
Yeah, I think there's another flip side to all of this and I'm learning just in fact, because of your questions, I learned something about when I was doing things in the classroom. And one of those things is that I did have students creating. We put so much emphasis on on being producers, right? We had this new technology, and for about 10, 15 years, we've been saying digital production, digital production, digital production. But I think we're missing something on the back end of that, and that is teaching our students to be better listeners, to be better consumers. So we can spend all this time, we may have just taken the pendulum and put it over too far now and said everybody just needs to produce. But there is active learning in becoming a better listener and focusing and listening in that time. So there's two sides of the communication.
Exactly. You need to be a good listener before you're a good speaker.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So as we're talking about podcasts in this episode, I would like to know which is your favorite podcast.
Well, it would be hard for me. Obviously, I love your podcast because I do learn so much about every educator. But I really, as you know, I'm a champion of student voice. And so I am a champion of all student podcasts. And I just, I listen to a lot of different, I listen to the murder mystery podcasts, and I love a crafted story and how it winds. And then, a really good one at the end, like flips you around and you go, what? I didn't know that was going to happen.
Right.
But I love student podcasts. I love hearing authentic student voices and their passion and their interest. And I truly celebrate the work that goes into those in those students that are taking these on today. And I hope to see more of that.
Right.
And I'll try and listen to every one of them.
That's really great. I agree with the point of, when the students taking up the podcasts, and like even I have been hooked to some of them. Like One of them is Empathy Impact Podcast, and another, like you mentioned, about murder mystery. I've been listening to Crime Junkies. Like, that podcast is all about like different things that happen all across the world about crime and how it's being solved. And one of them that's really famous Indian podcast that's Beer Biceps. So like even his podcasts are really inspiring, and he gets people on his podcast, asks them about their journey, and like he picks up inspiring stories about them. So I've been hooked to these podcasts, and besides that, like I'm mostly into the education sector, like on Spotify, whichever I see looks interesting, I'll listen to that, and there's different things to learn from them every day.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. So coming to my next question for you, Mr. Frank, is how can podcasts support an inclusive, diverse learning environment for students?
Well, again, I think that this is that exposure. It would be, part of the negative side of all of this technology, and especially now with the advent of artificial intelligence and, language processing. We're at an age where now things can become a bubble very quickly, right? The AI starts saying, well, you like this, so I'm going to keep you in this, and I'm never going to let you out of this bubble loop within your social media. And that may be true of podcasts as well. So I think as educators, we have to be sensitive to the fact that we need to create large bubbles for our students and give them exposure to cultural information. I'm so sorry. Cultural information and other countries, because this is where we can find areas of connecting with empathy and understanding other people's plights, other people's stories. And again, as students in a safe environment can look at podcasts. I mean, again, student podcasts from India to students who are in a classroom in America, or students who are finding interest in, there may be music. All of these things, I think, can create very diverse environments, which isn't possible if it's just my neighbor down the street, or the kids I play with every day, or the kids I game with every day because I know them. This technology allows us to really, really explore diversity. But I think we have to create exposure for that. An environment, again, we need to create an environment. But this time it's not a building. It's not expensive. It's something we can all do. Very accessible.
That's really amazing that you're talking about we need to create large bubbles for students and give them exposure to cultural information, because that's how they can understand about how to be inclusive, how to be diverse. And I totally agree with the point of, in having the empathy generated into them, because that's how they'll be able to understand like others' side of the story, listen to them, like you mentioned about being a good listener. Again, empathy is also linked with that. You need to listen to the person and then react. And again, exposure and the environment is the most important thing for them.
Absolutely.
Right. So in the end, like it's been amazing to talk to you today, and we would love to know where we can find you online. And also we would love to have a message from you for the audience watching us.
Well, I'd just like to, you can find me at fmoody@opera.com. You can also find me on Twitter, very active on Twitter, and it's at Frank W. Moody is my Twitter handle. And then I can send you my LinkedIn, because I don't know that I can repeat that because that's such a long link that they end up doing these days. And then you can find me out in the education world all the time, and especially with the Digital Citizenship Institute. I have been, just trying to champion all of that's been going on and talk about podcasts and the written record for history. I think that's been a beautiful month of great presentations, including your own. And thank you so much. And the last message I would like to leave the audience with is that, again, student voice and getting our students to be exposed to lots of different technologies, but to make that technology not so siloed, and maybe even all subjects to not be so siloed. That may be a very progressive view of education, but learning happens everywhere. And STEM is everywhere, and that would be my final message. Again, I'm an evangelist for game design in the humanities, that any game can be a part of your history learning. It can be a part of your language learning. It can be a part of anything. And I think you're like a beautiful example of that with your work in Minecraft. You show us that learning and the tools, the technology is just a tool for expanding our learning. And I love that. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much. And it's been an honor for me to have you on my podcast, listen to you today. And like you've mentioned about student voice, I totally agree with that fact, because the principal goal of education in school should be creating people who are capable of doing new things and not repeating what other generations have done. They can create people who are creative, inventive, discoverers, who can critically identify and verify and not just accept everything that offered. And that's when we are empowering student voice through podcasts, through technology, through games. We can create these individuals for the future change makers.
Yes.
Thank you. So
thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Frank, for being on my podcast today. And thank you everyone for joining and listening to this episode. And I'll see you in the next one. Till then, each one, teach 10. Have a nice day. Thank you.